welcome back. And today I'm going to be talking about the evolution of the female silhouette from about 1900 and into the 1960s. Before we get into the information, I want to do a quick note on the sources that I used. I get really frustrated when I watch videos like this and the sources aren't cited. I cannot stress enough how important it is to cite your sources because it makes you more accountable as a researcher for the information that you're giving. And it's also really helpful for the people consuming the information, because if they hear a piece of information that sounds kind of weird, they can go back into the sources and verify for themselves to see if A, that source is reliable, or B, the researcher actually understood the information, or C, if that's actually, a factual piece of information. So on that note, the sources that I used is this D.K. Smithsonian's Fashion, the Definitive History of Costume and Style. This is a super good book. It has a lot of pictures and it just represents the history in a really visual way. And the other source that I used was the Glamour Daze website, and that helped me when researching the 1940s. So with that said, let's get into the history. Starting with the early 1900s, the popular silhouette of the time was called the S-shape, which basically showcased a fuller bust, a slim waist, and a full bustle in the back. And this silhouette was made possible through the swanbill corset, which molded the body into this shape. And this corset was pretty popular from about 1900 until about 1910. Another key factor of the silhouette was the monobosom, which described the shape of the bosom as one continuous line that came from the chest to about the waist. So basically there wasn't a lot of differentiation between the bosom and the stomach. However, this silhouette gradually became more natural towards the end of the 1900s and into the 1910s. In fact, the corsets at the time shifted from the swanbill into these longer corsets that showcased a more natural, slim silhouette, and the skirts at the time also became a little slimmer. And during World War I, beginning in 1914, this simpler silhouette was really solidified. The silhouette was very simple and slim, and people wanted just looser, more practical clothing. And during this time, the skirts shortened a little bit so the feet were visible. You could see the feet poking out from under the skirt, and there was a popular skirt trend at the time where the fabric was a little looser on the hips, but it became more slim at the ankle, so it created this sort of almost triangle shape. There's also a lot of military influence in the fashions at the time, which obviously it's wartime. Of course that would happen. So styles like the trench coat became very popular. Getting into the 1920s, the silhouette shifted again. It's almost like the very natural slim silhouette of the previous decade went to a greater extreme. The popular silhouette of the time was this very flat-chested, youthful, and boyish figure. Possibly one of the most characteristic aspects of 1920s fashion is the drop waist, which basically meant the waistline shifted from the natural waist to at the hips. And the skirt length at the time also shortened a lot. The length of the skirts fluctuated over time, ranging from ankle length to below the knee, and sometimes at the knee. In fact, from about 1927 to 1928, the skirt was at its shortest length. And hemlines at the time had a lot of variety. They could come in a very straight, more traditional shape, or they came in more irregular shapes too. Coco Chanel was very popular at the time and was gaining a lot of influence in the fashion world, and she advocated for a very simple style that conformed to this very slim silhouette. And she styled clothes that were very comfortable yet very stylish as well. However, not all fashion during the 1920s was like this. During this time, robes to style gained a lot of influence, and this was almost a counter to the typical silhouette. Instead of the very, straight silhouette, this style had full skirts, and the waistline could either be at the natural waist or lower, or sometimes it came in this high-low shape. And sometimes hemlines also came in this high-low shape as well, so it brought a lot of variety into the fashion of the 1920s. Getting into the 1930s, the silhouette was very tall, slender, and graceful, with some more angled curves and stronger shoulders. And during this time, the modern bra, as we know it, grew in popularity, and that impacted how the silhouette looked as well. The waistline also rose back up to slightly above the natural waist, and The waist was also emphasized more than in the previous decade with the use of belts and things like that. Skirts also became longer and they were very slim, and sometimes they flared a bit at the bottom. Evening gowns too really embraced this more natural silhouette as they flowed down the body in a very natural way and flaunted the shape of the body. And low backs were also very popular during this time in evening wear. In the 1940s, the silhouette once again changed. I think you're sensing a pattern here. During this time, the silhouette emphasized strong shoulders and a defined waist with a narrow skirt. The silhouette was generally very strong and athletic looking. As this was wartime, the US actually became a very important influence in the fashion world. In previous decades, Paris was a really big influencer in the fashion world, but because of the German occupation in France at the time, Paris couldn't have as much influence, so the US stepped up to the plate in leading on the fashions of the 1940s. And the US was all about very easy and ready-to-wear wardrobes and practical styles, similar to the mindset of the fashions of World War I. During this time, a lot of restrictions were put on clothes because of rationing, so in the US, like skirt width and sleeve width and hem depth were limited. And this was also the case in Britain, like the number of pleats and buttons and seams. There was like a limited number to how many of those could be in a given piece of clothing. But the main challenge of this decade was to make clothes both practical and stylish at the same time. Now in the 1950s, I think most of us can kind of visualize the silhouette. The silhouette included a small waist, very dainty shoulders, and full hips. It promoted this very round and feminine appearance, and girdles and other undergarments were used to make this silhouette possible on most women. And this silhouette was first popularized by the designer Dior in his New Look collection from 1947. This big shift in the silhouette really flagged the fact that Paris was gaining more influence again in the fashion world because, again, this is post-war time. You know, Paris was healing from the war and they were able to get back to the old influences that they had before World War II. And with this new silhouette, full hips were a very key aspect. Skirts could either be full or they could be narrow, but in both cases the hips were emphasized to again create this very feminine look. And also because the war was over and fabric wasn't rationed anymore, these fashions could use more fabric than they could previously. And both everyday and high fashion like to conform to this silhouette and use a lot of fabric that they couldn't really use in the previous decade. Getting into the 1960s, this silhouette remained pretty popular in the early 60s, but obviously things started to change in the 60s as well. I almost in my mind, and someone could verify this for me, I almost think of in my mind, I think of the 60s in two parts. I think of like Kennedy era 60s and then post-Kennedy era 60s. I think of Kennedy era 60s as being a little bit more similar to the 50s, and then post-Kennedy era to be more of the kind of like 60s mod look that we tend to think of. There's probably a lot wrong with that mindset, but that's how I tend to think of it. But the bottom line is early 60s was a little bit more similar to the 50s in its fashions, but then the later 60s really diverged down a different path. However, during the 1960s in general, the silhouette was kind of reverting back to this slim, flat, and girlish figure, and A-line cuts with some to minimal curves were very popular. The model Twiggy is a great example of this new silhouette, as she was, short and skinny and very young, and she wasn't super curvy. She just promoted this very girlish sort of figure. And even evening gowns had a more natural silhouette with minimal waist definition and less emphasis on the bust and hips in comparison to the previous decade. Also during this time around 1964, the mini dress became very popular, and this style very much reflected the new silhouette as they were A-line cut with, again, very minimal curves. And skirts during this time continued to get shorter and shorter, reaching above the knee, which wasn't really a thing during the 20th century until the 60s. So, given all that information, you can see that even in the span of 60 years, the silhouette changed so much, reflecting a lot of the challenges and ideals of each decade. However, each silhouette really showcased the beauty of a different kind of woman, from the extremely feminine woman of the 1950s to the more practical woman of the 1910s. And I think this great variety in the silhouette and the different ways to showcase the beauty of women ultimately proves the inherent beauty of the female body. With all that said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and let me know if you enjoyed this kind of video and if you want me to do other videos like this. I've been kind of thinking about doing a men's fashion evolution one, but let me know if that's something that you'd be interested in, or other suggestions for more historical evolution kind of videos. I'd love to hear your suggestions. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to make a new video soon. Bye!